Okay, hello everyone. Good to see a lot of familiar faces. A very happy Wednesday to all of you. And we are back again with meeting number 17 with Fil Gamaghelian and Könül De Moor on our original format. So I'm Arnold Alaberdin, one of the co-organizers of this project. And Bright Garden Voices is a grassroots initiative which provides a platform for constructive dialogue between Armenians and Azerbaijanis and anything relevant, any expert or experienced opinions relevant to Armenians and Azerbaijanis. So we host online meetings and in-person activities where guests share their experiences and ideas relating to the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict or any other matter relating to the two nations and societies. Our meetings also include live interaction with our audience, and the meetings are recorded and made available on YouTube and as podcast, and of course on our various social media pages. Today, my fellow co-hosts are Ayla Azizova and Anush Grati, and I will pass on the floor to Ayla. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Arnold. Hello, everyone. My name is Ayla Azizova. I'm an architect and researcher. I'm based in the Netherlands, originally from Azerbaijan, Baku, was born and raised there. In my work, I'm mostly focused on exploring different spatial strategies, interventions, with a focus on informal architecture as a tool of activism and mediation in social, geopolitical, and environmental crisis. I'm also part of the several initiatives such as Architectural Climate Activist Network and Bright Garden Voices. With Bright Garden Voices, I've been actively involved since 2021 by also co-hosting events and also contributing to various activities within these initiatives. With that, I will pass it over to my other fellow co-host, Anush.
Thanks, Ayla. I'm Anush Grati. I'm a VGV volunteer based in Rosario, Argentina. I'm a writer, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Anush. So this is episode 17 in our Zoom format, and we are joined by Phil and Könül to discuss recent developments and more generally the region, the conflict in general. So in recent months, Yerevan and Baku have reported advanced progress on peace negotiations, yet persisting tensions and uncertainties questions whether the prospects for normalization between the two states and societies are within reach. Our guests today, Könül and Phil, will share their insights on the current situation as well as on the past and future of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflicts and their mediation efforts. So, to walk us through the format of today's meeting and to introduce our speakers, I'll now hand it over to my co-host Ayla.
Thank you, Arnold. So before we begin our discussion, I would like to quickly go over today's format and a few important notes. First, we will start with the guest and moderator discussion. Afterwards, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please send it directly to Arnold in private message. And if you have your camera and microphone turned on, you may ask your question directly. As always, the meeting is being recorded and will be available online. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you can use just your first name or pseudonym. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first guest, Philip Gamaghelian. He's Associate Professor and a Director of Masters in Science in Conflict Management and Resolution Program at University of San Diego. He is also a managing editor at Caucasus Edition and a director of programs at the Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation. Welcome, Philip. We're very glad to have you here with us today. And now to introduce our second guest, I will hand it over to Anush.
Thank you, Ayla. Our second guest is Könül De Moor. She is a consultant conflict analyst at the International Crisis Group with a decade of experience in political and civil society development across the South Caucasus. Her work mainly focuses on conflict transformation, policy analysis, and gender equality. Thank you for being here. So we are going to start with the Q&A. I'm going to make the first question for both of you. Könül, you can answer first if you like. So the first question is, how would you characterize the current stage of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan? What is happening at this moment?
Thank you, Anush. Thank you very much for your question and for presentation. And thank you for invitation in general. Current state. So I think at the moment we can describe the current situation as like a waiting mood, I would say. The foreign ministers, both Armenia and Azerbaijan, they met during the Antalya Diplomatic Forum, like 10 days ago, 12th of April. And except of hearing that the sides are committed to and ready to carry on with the dialogue, I don't think that we heard anything drastically new. So after making that landmark announcement in mid-March, when the side said that they finalized the text of the treaty, peace treaty, there's a period, kind of a latent, quiet period where the sides, I would say, wait each other to make a first step. So we know that there are two preconditions that Azerbaijan is putting forward, precondition of signing the agreement. So one of them is dissolving OSCE Minsk group, the main body that was mediating this conflict in the 90s. And the second one is the constitutional change that they were pushing forward in Armenia. So after making that announcement, both sides tried in a way to throw the ball to each other's side, encouraging to make the next step. So we heard very clearly, I think, from Baku saying that the ball now is on Armenian side, and Armenian side in a way saying that those preconditions, they're really stopping for these negotiations to go forward. So now it's quiet, and there are certain announcements that were made in Antalya Forum, such as, I think it came from the Armenian foreign minister, saying that Azerbaijan and Armenia can sign the agreement and at the same time sign the dissolvement of the OSCE Minsk group. So that was the new thing. But rather, other than that, I would say that it's quiet, and I think everyone is awaiting what's going to be the next.
Thank you, Könül. Phil, do you want me to repeat the question, or is it okay?
That's good. Thank you. So first, thank you to Bright Garden Voices team for the invitation, and very happy to share the screen with Könül. In principle, yeah, I agree with everything Könül said. Where we are, I think, in terms of content of negotiations, it's all agreed effectively. The conditions that are on the table are actually kind of new and outside of what was negotiated for the last 2 years bilaterally. Where I'll say the conflict is in a very stalled place. Essentially, the content disagreements are essentially resolved, but the interest of moving forward, at least from the side of Baku, isn't there yet. The question then is, what is possible? Yeah, what are the possibilities? I think there is a small chance for all options are open in principle. They could go towards peace. This could go towards further escalation. I think that further escalation chance is much higher in different ways. What can prompt an agreement is potentially some kind of regional escalations that I think both sides, especially Azerbaijan, calculates is too risky if the conflict continues. but we are not seeing that yet. The question then for me is why we are not signing an agreement despite effectively, so if it was Karabakh conflict, Karabakh itself has been, of course, taken by Azerbaijan, so that's not necessarily an obstacle you would think anymore for some kind of Victor's peace solution. Then why don't we have a solution? I'll outline three dynamics in my view that are holding us back. One is identity. Throughout these 30 years of conflict, it's transformed away from being Karabakh only. It became very Armenian-Azerbaijani, ethnically framed one. So both independent identities of independent Armenia and then the independent Azerbaijan have been built in opposition to each other. So being Armenian means to be anti-Azerbaijani effectively and vice versa. And that's very much supported through everything from commemoration ceremonies to textbooks to cultural production to political speeches, despite some references to different angles from Pashinyan. Overall, that's where the both societies tell themselves. There was an attempt to intentionally move it away from it in 2023, 24, but I don't see neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan finding an alternative identity yet. And it went back to, essentially this, and then enmity is simply based on enmity itself. That's one. The basis of identity is that enmity right now. Second and related is absence of culture of peace. We see it as, you need to win or lose. It's a culture of domination. So conflict is dealt with through violence and domination. Armenian side effectively dominated for 20, 30 years, not willing to compromise. Well, it could hold territories. Now Azerbaijan is dominating, and that is effectively the way we deal with conflict. There is no discussion of benefits of peace. Peace is seen as a loss and a compromise. From Azerbaijan position now, why would I give away something? Similar was with Armenia until 2020 war, right? And from Armenian side, it's very much seen as kind of very humiliating defeat that you have to be imposed some form of a peace, right? So both sides see it as a negative. There is no discussion even of what the benefit of peace can be in everyday life. And the third one, which I won't go too far into, but it's obvious one, probably the normative crisis worldwide. It's not clear what a solution to conflict in principle means anymore. It was pretty clear in 90s, right or wrong, different story, but it was clear what it is. It's a democratization, integration in international community, human rights, and so on. That's not the case anymore. So there is no, in principle, I don't think anybody can name what a peace, either in Armenia, Azerbaijan, or in Northern Ireland or anywhere else, is. So, and then you don't know what it is, then it's very hard to work toward that. So, sorry, pretty bleak picture.
Thank you, Phil. Ayla?
Thank you, Anush. Let's proceed then to our next question. Maybe actually we can start with you, Phil. How would you describe actually undergoing the peace negotiations, and what do you think are the major point of disagreements, and what kind of challenges both governments facing with respect, of course, of their own society in reaching the final settlement?
Well, I think we talked about it already a bit, but content-wise, most issues have been solved either through violence or through negotiations. And so big question was Karabakh's belonging. That's removed really from negotiation tables, through the war. Second was the rights of Karabakh Armenians, also removed through ethnic cleansing. Then there were a lot of outstanding issues, of course, that have been negotiated. There was a problem of format of negotiations. Minsk Group lost its meaning after the war, essentially. Then there was forum shopping between Moscow, Washington, and Brussels. None of them worked necessarily, and the format was found of bilateral negotiations, right? So, and in this format, the sides were very constructively and pretty quick overall able to agree on every outstanding issue. So there is no content disagreement, in my view, left anymore. The conditions, though, but then we don't have peace, right? So we don't even have a peace agreement. So conditions appear, or new conditions appear as we go. So these two, just 6 months ago, these two weren't necessarily existent. And as closer we get to agreeing on some, the new ones appear. primarily from Azerbaijan as the winning side and who feels it can get more and more and more. Again, Armenia was behaving not that differently a few years ago. So I think it's that overall culture of dealing with conflict through domination. So in that sense, I'm not convinced that when I see Minsk group abolishment or and so on and so forth, any of this is enough. So I don't think content matters anymore, essentially, because I don't see much content disagreement. Even on constitutional reform, Armenia was already working towards the change on its own before it was politicized, which created obstacle actually for constitutional reform once it became precondition, right? So it would, and things like that. I think every step is in principle more of an obstacle created to stop normalization than any substantial content disagreements. I think content-wise, this is weirdly, strangely settled conflict at this stage. It can escalate to something new, but it's not there yet.
Thank you, Phil. What you can add about this, Könül?
Thanks. I can only add, so not maybe disagreements. I do agree with many things that Phil said. And these new conditions that keep on coming, like that, in a way, stop the progress of signing the peace agreement, right? And there's a very, I would say, an interesting development in the way how certain stakeholders are explaining, for example, that. Because, as Phil said, we can see that both agreeing on dissolving the Minsk group and also making constitutional changes, it's pretty much agreed. Like, Armenia is willing to do that. Of course, the one thing when but they say it's internal affairs of Armenia. So the one thing is when you decide to run the referendum and change. The other thing is when the opposite side pushing on that. So it perceived internally as well quite negative. So, but there are very interesting explanations of why those conditions are there. And from the talk from certain stakeholders, I've come to realize that, and they are quite open, that there are absolutely zero trust between the sides. So, and in a way, Azerbaijan also want to secure, so they want to close this chapter. They want to close the chapter of this conflict, and they want to seal it based on the document. To the question, for example, to my question that referendum can also not be a guarantee of one referendum can say, yes, okay, we're removing it. Then the governments might change and another government might come and run the second referendum and they can overrule the result of the first one. So, but because there are no trust, some sort of document can give a certain security, I think, so that, okay, this is secure, we're turning this page. So, in short, like, not again the disagreement between the sides, but the absence of trust is one of the major problems, I think, and why this is not going forward with signing, with finalizing, because again, as Phil said, like context-wise and everything is agreed. It's finalized. So the only thing is signing, but the lack of trust, I think, prevents it, and that's something that should be worked on, which takes a lot of time, actually. And we see everything is happening quite in a way, or a desire for things to happen quite quickly. So,
yeah, thank you for both of your perspective. I think it's very important topics that we're touching upon. I think we can proceed with the next question with Anush.
Yes. Könül, so do you think there are different understandings of peace in the conflict? And if so, which are they? How can peace can be achieved if it means something different for each party in the negotiation?
I don't think the different understanding of conflict, but I think I more think the different priorities that the both sides have. So, and it's not just different priorities, I would call them even antagonizing priorities. So, how if we need to assess the current situation, right, what is perceived as a threat to Azerbaijan, for example, and what are the priorities of Armenia, we can see that they're fundamentally different. And those are antagonizing priorities that drive fears, insecurities, forces the sides, and we can see the arm race at the moment, right, between the sides and everything. So it's about those different, very much antagonizing priorities. And also, I think each side sees the conflict from their own greed. So again, when you speak diplomats or stakeholders in Azerbaijan, you can sense that they want an agency, they want acknowledgement of their grief after the first Karabakh war. They openly say that we didn't see the reaction that we see now after the second. We were not supported and everything. And the same at the moment we can see from Armenian side. So it's like each side sees the conflict from their own loss, own traumas, and that also sometimes prevents, you know, to see a clear picture. That's why I think that the initiatives and platforms like this, like yours, they're very much important in terms of bringing the sides together, perhaps not on track one level, but like a civil society to hear each other's side and to see a clear picture of how the other side is interested.
Thank you, Könül. This is so interesting. I never thought of this point of view. And Philip, how do you feel about this? Do you think there are different understandings of this also or not?
By and large, I agree with Könül that it's a lot of requests to acknowledge, let's say, the grievances, but it's very narrowly focused on grievances, right? So by both sides, only seeing the other side as primarily the violator, let's say, and themselves as victim who maybe reacted here and there, but not necessarily as equally responsible party. I think that I'll circle back to what I said earlier. I feel there is this culture of peace or understanding of war and peace in a very problematic mix of offensive realism and ethno-nationalism. So offensive realism, this is comes from, I mean, 19th century probably Europe, but more pertinently to Caucasus from Soviet and Gimo school of international relations, which is, you know, offensive realism effectively is religion, right? So you are continually in some form, almost at the status of religion. You don't question that that's how you conduct foreign policy. So that's one version, as in you continually look to maximize power and attack. But that is coupled very problematically with ethno-nationalism in our case, because at least offensive realism is pragmatic. Yes, it tries to maximize power continually, so it's not peace-oriented, but it also knows when you're going to lose and where you don't anymore keep pushing. But that coupled with ethno-nationalism and grievances, it brings it in this space where they are continually trying to dominate, even if it's suicidal almost, even when it's in the long term damages you. So it's very clearly, we saw that on Armenia's behavior. Yeah, when it was any pragmatism would show that they're gonna get a war and lose a war. And yet government after government refused to compromise and escalated. And now we are seeing it from Azerbaijan. It's hard to see now where Azerbaijan can necessarily suffer at this point as being in a pretty strong position. But then so was Armenia, yes, so 20, 30 years ago. Maybe vis-a-vis Armenia, it has a long spin of time when it will be stronger, but continuous conflict, in my view, strictly pragmatically puts the whole region in danger. Georgia potentially losing sovereignty, followed by Armenia probably losing sovereignty, right? So that we haven't seen Caucasus where one of the states was able to survive long enough, right? So it then puts then all three effectively in a space of, in some form, losing sovereignty, that maybe in 5-10 years down the road. Who said that Russia gonna not turn? Who said that Russia-Azerbaijan relations gonna remain good. They were good between Russia and Georgia 20 years ago. Now see where they are, right? So things can turn pretty quick, but yet that pragmatism is not missing. We have this of realism, supposedly, but more offensive attempt to dominate, coupled with very, very problematic ethno-nationalism, which makes this kind of war never ending. And that, in that sense, I don't see any difference. I think both sides are seeing it exactly the same way. Armenia would dominate if it could. It just can't. And right now, Azerbaijan dominates.
Thank you both for your answers. Ayla.
Yes, let's go to our next question. So maybe we can start with you, Phil, but by mentioning all the elements that you just pointed out, and also considering the current state of affairs between Azerbaijan and Armenia, are the track 1 and track 2 mediation efforts more likely to be consequential, or this could change in some point? What do you think?
Oh, yeah, unfortunately, being a peace builder, being a big proponent of track 2 for a long time, I'd have to say now that track 1 remains, and as long as we are dealing with nation states, yeah, so as primary actors in this space, track 1 was and remains relevant, of course. It was, whether it's democracy or authoritarianism, whether it's kind of almost irrespective of geopolitical and political situation, that track is relevant and remains. Track 2, I think, is in a major crisis because of multiple reasons, but I still will bring it back to the normative one. It made sense again in 90s, 2000s in a very particular way. Yes, we were democratizing, joining European Union structures. Institutional civil society was to be an actor, and was for a period of time an actor. So in that space, that's where track 2 was. It was not simply non-official efforts. It was very particular type of non-official efforts, which is effectively institutionalized, NGO-led, yeah, in support, in collaboration with European Union, US international community, and to the extent they could, also official negotiation process. It's a lot of youth dialogue efforts, right, in principle of preparing population for that eventual coexistence. Now all of these conditions are removed of peace, all of them, right? So there is no kind of liberal institutional community necessarily present in any meaningful sense. NGO sector is completely collapsing. USAID was shut down, the probably biggest donor, probably at least one of the 2 biggest donors worldwide of it, right? So the countries that were supporters of this order are themselves turning against it. US, of course, in the lead. So in that sense, there is no liberal peace version moving forward. And yet the track 2 continues to function as if there is. And there is a serious problem in that sense, right? What exactly they are playing into. There is no second step to it. So I think in this sense, track 2 is quite meaningless, and again, very painful to say from somebody's perspective who was in that for years myself. But I think the new type of track 2 is necessary, or track 2s potentially. Maybe track 2 is the wrong language even, but non-official, let's say, initiatives. Primarily internally at this point, I think there's a lot of need for work within societies, such as on things of how do we see what conflict is, by the way, applied also to internal politics. It's same exactly what we are seeing across the border, we are seeing internally. It's somebody going for complete domination, and then somebody else trying to overthrow and go for the same level, maybe worse domination. Yeah, so we do this in gender relations, we do this in inter-party relations, we do this across the border. So that's working very much on understanding what conflict is and maybe different ways of handling it between different groups. There is a major polarization in Armenia we are seeing, very much a domination by particular group in Azerbaijan, and so on and so forth. So I think that's one, changing the culture of conflict is extremely important, and that internal dialogues. And maybe again, non-NGO, very different type of non-official efforts need to be, are developing, but need to develop a bit more systematically, let's say. But that, I think we should just give up on the idea that the NGO sector is coming back in any meaningful sense.
Thank you. And what's your opinion about it, Könül? What you can add up?
Again, I mainly agree with Phil. I would just want to add that that crisis happened for quite a while in civil society. So That also, I think, what I've been observing those years, it also has to do with the generational change too. So, and there was this massive gap between the generations, and the newer generation, they wanted in a way to remove themselves from this classic understanding of NGOs, how they run, how they work. And I think the problem was that, so they brought this new idea. They opposed the traditional NGOs and their functioning, but they were a lack of, I would say, a plan, a clear plan that we were opposing, and this is what we're suggesting. And that, I think, caused a certain crisis. So, but one thing is for sure, that they pushed the button and there's no way back, I think. So it is now we see this transformation of something new, some initiative, but not the classic NGOs. And this transformation, I think, can contribute into, in general, into peace building, into the preparation of the people for peace, in dialogues, in confidence building. So, and I would say that, of course, as with many things, there are positives and negatives that comes with each form of those organizations or initiatives or even activism. The newer generation brought this inclusivity side of it, which I think contributed a lot, involving the most marginalized, unheard voices, for example, right? So, and I think that is something that could be built upon and move forward. But otherwise, I totally agree with what you said.
Thank you for both of your perspective. Anu, shall we move to the next question?
Yes, thank you, Ayla. So Könül, let's keep on going with you. You wrote this concept of transformation, and following that, we were wondering that the liberal order that has been a prominent force in the West also seems to be undergoing significant changes and transformations. So how does this impact the South Caucasus now and in the future?
So yeah, I mean, it's quite a times, isn't it? Like every day we're waking up, and when checking news, you don't even first believe. You're checking if it's fake or not. You know, this is the time that we're living, and I would say the Western democracy is in crisis, and we see stuff drastically changing from the capitals, where previously 10 years ago, if not less, we looked upon, right? And we took that model, even if it's not the best one, but it was the most acceptable one. And by the way, that's another difference between the previous NGOs and the civil society members and the new generation. New generation, I think they stopped worshipping, so to speak, the West and see that as the only model. They start questioning that. So they brought different angles to it, which in a way challenged the Western institutions as well, like those big donor institutions. And I think that's a nice thing to have different options and to, in general, challenge well-established institutions. So, and because that role model is now going through a massive crisis, the societies and the states, indeed, like in South Caucasus, they're questioning their, I wouldn't say legitimacy, but their right to preach, so to speak. So again, in many conversations with diplomats and with the stakeholders in Baku, it's like, and with the ordinary people, you know, sometimes we are forgetting that ordinary people, it is a representative. They are representatives of the country. And you speak with them, there's the main question they're asking. They say, why what is allowed to one is not allowed for us? Why the same a like conflict, it's perceived differently to different countries, to different nations, or indeed people represent a different race, for example, right? So these countries start questioning. And now countries like Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, like in South Caucasus, smaller countries, they want their agencies, and they want those agencies to be unlocked. So it really depends on how Western world going to cope with this crisis that is ongoing. It's, I think, certain that there's again no going back point, so there will be changes. And I think for quite a while, those changes and the questions, like why it is allowed for one is not allowed for others, it will keep on challenging those very institutions. And everything depends on how the West is gonna resolve this. So is it gonna resolve this in an inclusive manner, in a manner that will give agencies and will treat the countries in a way equally or not? So I'm afraid I'm a little bit pessimist in that, how it's going to be in future in the South Caucasus, because I don't see this crisis that the West is ongoing to be resolved anytime soon, because we also see the rise of the far right. We see the cut of the funds, and this comes from a very part of the Western democratic world.
Thank you, Könül. And Phil, what do you think about this shift in the liberal order? How is it impacting the South Caucasus in the present and in the future?
Yeah, so I think that, again, agreeing with a lot what Könül said, actually quite classical. All the critics of liberal peace were saying that the agency actually gonna arise from pushback against kind of liberal domination, which is exactly what we are seeing. And the domination doesn't exist anymore, by the way, but it's a full-blown collapse. I don't think it's anymore even a crisis of liberal order. But so the agency, it's interesting, it's the first time we are seeing bilateral negotiations, right? And on the content, it wasn't even conceptualized as such. It was when we were discussing a possibility of it, somehow didn't almost make sense until recently, and that seemed to be the only format. So on government level, you are seeing it, and increasingly you are seeing it also on civil society level. So yeah, so non-governmental level. Most of the initiatives since the war have been actually bilateral and led by Armenians and Azerbaijanis. So you have this reclaiming of the agency at the same time in a very, very problematic time. So that's one. Like, I don't know if we can certainly positive impact. Is it enough to make a change? It's a different question. What I see possible in this situation is. Well, one is, I'd say, forgetting about conflict resolution. So that's where peace agreement, equating it with peace, I don't see much value in that because, again, the peace had some kind of a conceptual basis. It was this liberal democracy you're going to build, and that's going to be that solution. Yeah, through that, you're going to manage coexistence, reconciliation, and intersocietal relations through these essentially international liberal norms. That doesn't exist anymore as an institution that can be achievable. So without that, I don't see any solution, and there is no alternative really take on resolution other than somebody basically takes over the other and continual dominates, right? A very illiberal version. So in absence of any kind of vision for solution or any blueprint for a solution, I think like two things are necessary. One is a straight up, very realist conflict management. So let's hopefully convince each other that it's better off to keep this negative peace, as a permanent ceasefire, as opposed to escalating into new direct violence. So that's one, and continual work in this direction, and very track one and very pragmatic level, while simultaneously through this new agency look for utopias. Essentially, what are these kind of essentially not the liberal, but what are, because we don't have post-liberal, non-liberal really ways of conceiving peace necessarily either. So maybe, and that's why experimenting with them is extremely dangerous, because even if they exist, they are very, very marginal, rudimentary, very niche in a way. So, but probably starting to talk about what it is, this post-collapse of liberalism space, right? So, and how do we maybe champion that space? So I think this like combination of very hard conflict management with effectively utopias. I don't even know what else to call that at this point.
Thank you both so much. Ayla.
Yes, let me directly start with the question. I think, Phil, you can just follow up. And overall, of course, despite all this West friction globally in the world and all the pessimistic aspect, I want to both like ask you, Phil and Könül, you've been in this conflict studies already for some time, and looking back, what do you think groups and individuals involved in the Armenian-Azerbaijan sphere did good? And was there anything that could be done differently or better?
Yes, I go on. The system seems to be, yeah, it's my turn on that. So I think what we've done well is that there is a peace building community of some form. Yes, so whether people call themselves peace building or not, but people actively working across the conflict divide despite everything. And increasingly, Armenian-Azerbaijan is without money necessarily, without any kind of external prompting, very much getting that agency that we discussed is there. It's kind of persevered and maybe increased, especially the agency part, maybe not numbers, but really the ownership and the leadership taken in how to drive this peace conversation has been very Armenian-Azerbaijani driven heavily. And that's not a given. So it's not, I wouldn't, so like look around, come around us, and unfortunately in Ukraine, Georgia, many other places, I haven't seen it that emerge to the extent I've seen it in our context. So again, I think that's an achievement, and that's an achievement of intentional risk-taking and claiming agency, but actually doing something with that, right? So I think that's a positive and shouldn't be understated that we are having this conversation, and many, many, many others right now. Now that's the good. The bad, despite that extreme fragmentation, no solidarity, a lot of major corporatization that happened and now is collapsing. But I think we are a very classical case of everything wrong with liberal peace building projects. And perhaps because of when it started in the 90s, we completely adopted it, almost very textbook version of with all its problems, basically. So it was extreme corporatization, extreme bureaucratization, extreme kind of competition, and very intentional kind of destruction of competition. So like everything wrong you can see, the textbooks, right, that happened. So this is a big problem, and I think it really continues, which as a result, we are seeing major fragmentation of, although we have a lot of people doing peace, but not necessarily even in talking terms with each other. And then what we could do different, I think, was your question, part of your question. I'm advocating for agonistic solidarity. Then we don't need to agree to support each other, right? So making sure, like essentially getting away from competition with simple understanding that even, although I said we are numerous simply compared to other conflicts who, had even less. But it's still a very marginal, small crowd, and none of us have the answer. Liberals clearly, I think, and hopefully except to this point, didn't get us to the answer. Neither, I think, any of the post-liberal groups necessarily are getting into any answer that is acceptable outside of 10 people niche space. Realists are pretty much driving us back to conflict, right? So there is none of us so far was able to point way forward. So with that humbleness, acknowledging that, yes, I might be convinced in my view, but I'm actually wrong. And I do need, right, to alternative opinions and being challenged and support these other views. So that's where I think we need, which we haven't done well. I think we've done really badly, and we are too convinced that my niche opinion is somehow the answer, and yet we weren't able to probably even convince our own friends and families in that.
Well, thank you. And what about you, Könül? What is your experience? Is there something intersecting what Philip just said?
Definitely, definitely. I would put like, if I may, of course, like to split it like before 2020 and after 2020, right? And I think the positive thing before and after 2020 was that, and I completely agree with you on this, that the initiatives, yes, like civil society members, activists, like many, like on NGO level, they kept on meeting up. Dialogue was there, and it's not a given. And they still do that. And throughout, they were doing that as well. So, of course, it doesn't mean that there were no harsh meetings or like, you know, emotional ones when people were, but the fact that it was there, it's very important. And this is something that we don't see in many conflicts now when the sides are so polarized that they don't even want to meet up. So I think the positive thing before and after 2020 was like the sides, they always, they were willing, they were meeting up, and a lot of things were, has been achieved. If we need to call the names, and unfortunately both of them are passed away, for example, it was Abbas Hazanov, it was Gamaghelyan, for example, right? And those were people who were challenging the main narratives. They were talking about very uncomfortable topics. And I think that was something that could have been done differently. So before 2020, even though the sides were meeting up and everything, they were kind of trying to avoid sharp corners, avoid hard topics. So because in a way, the status quo that was back then was quite well established. Some even mediators, they were in a way fine with the status quo, thinking that no war, no peace, you know, let's keep it in this and keep on contributing into the civil society so that they can meet up, building confidence and the dialogue and everything, and the youth organizations. But I think not mentioning and trying to avoid sharp corners in a way, in a little bit, and I'm saying stuff that I witnessed, made those processes a little bit fake, I would say, because there was still something that you wouldn't ask, that you wouldn't say. I think that changed after 2020. That changed, which is positive. What is again very important here, and I again please do take this credit, like initiatives like yours, and the one that the Phil is co-directing, is the safer space where people can ask, people can face, and people can talk. So this is something that should be, the credit should be taken, and something that needs to carry on, because it is very inspiring, I would say. And I just want to bring maybe a couple of examples of how, like, I witnessed that in initiatives that led by you and by Phil's organization. There were a couple of times when I was approached, for example, from a very young generation from Armenian side, and asking about, for example, Khojalu tragedy. So, and you can see that, and it's very emotional moment. And then you talk about tragic events in Baku and Sumgayit, and then, you know, it's exchange. People don't know, and they feel comfortable to ask this. And giving them space to do that, it's very important. And I remember a couple of years ago, Arnold, please take this credit to you. I think Arnold was the first ever Armenian I saw who on social media conveyed his condolences on 26th of February. Like, it was shocking, right? And it was like, but it is a very courageous thing, and it boosts your own courage to face a very uncomfortable thing. So one person can really indeed confidence, boost this desire to also the curiosity of to know, face, perhaps apologize and move on. So we can see it now happening after 2020. I'm happy to say that, which wasn't before. So, but we did have an activist, and again, those big names who are unfortunately not with us, who were challenging. Unfortunately, in the Caucasus, I would say we don't have this passing the torch thing. You know, sometimes people are gone, and we are really struggling to find new ones. But a newer generation who are much more curious, I would say, and less traumatized than the previous one, like this conflict. There's a huge hope on them, and yeah.
Well, thank you a lot. It was a lot of important notes. I think we can learn a lot from the past, what was done good, and still look for the good points which can be done in the future, I would say. Which leads us to the next question. Maybe Anush, you can proceed.
Yes, thank you, Ayla. So, can you thinking about these elements that you were bringing to the table, what do you think, which fundamental elements are necessary for a sustainable peace in the region? Are successful negotiations on a peace agreement enough? And if not, what else is necessary?
Thank you, Anush. Of course, successful negotiations, like on that level, on track one, like it's very important. Political will is very important. But then peace on paper doesn't necessarily mean peace in reality, right? After all, it is about people who's going to live together, coexist. And sometimes, unfortunately, when conflict is extended, grievances also are extending, then you're antagonizing each other, even dehumanization is there, you know. And it is hard for people to say, oh, okay, if now the state signed the agreement, we are friends. Because those things do not happen that fast. That's why it's very important to include track 2 and 3 in all this process to make it as complete and sophisticated as possible, so that people who are the main agents, right, who are going to live together, they were ready for peace. So that would be sustainable. The role of civil society here is very important. And I want to mention one problem that I'm observing now in peace building community is that it is polarized. And even more so, this canceling culture is blooming, I would say. So it's like, if you are not with me, then you're against me. There's intolerance of diversity of opinions, you know, pluralism. It's also one of the core of democracy. So they can be different, they should be different opinions. And then canceling culture, I'm observing that anyone from the community, if something that they say is remotely similar that the states are saying, for example, they get labeled straight away and outcasted. So this is not healthy, I think, and it will not contribute to a building the society as whole, you know, and definitely not contribute to the peace and establishing peace between the people. So I think that thing, if sorted, that can contribute to sustainable peace. And of course, sustainable peace is also when both sides, in a way, are winning. Of course, like in terms of like winning the war and everything, there's a winner and loser. But when the peace signs, you should understand that they are winning from that. There should be no humiliation of one another, because peace will bring victory for both and prosperity as well. So that idea that we are both winning from that, it's also contributes to sustainability. So these 3 elements, I think, are very important.
Thank you, Könül. And you, Phil, what's your take on these necessary elements for sustainable peace in the region?
I'll be pretty pessimistic there. I don't think there is a sustainable peace possible in principle anytime soon. From, again, the position I already voiced, which is it needs some form of a blueprint. It needs some kind of a system, which was the liberal peace that is gone. So there, I don't know what is sustainable peace. Yeah, we cannot conceive it. How can you get there? That's one very pragmatic problem. But second is that I also, starting from Brubaker and many contemporary also Armenian-Azerbaijani commentators have said that there is no solution to this. I don't see so these ethnic conflicts don't get solved in principle. They might go away once the political circumstances changed. I'll think of an example not far from the region, Armenian-Kurdish relationship. There was a pretty violent relationship not that long ago, and there was no reconciliation efforts, there was no peace building done, nothing. It's just the circumstances changed, right? So they are now, minorities in similar countries or things like that, and that somehow then their status is they are in opposition to somebody else, not with each other. Armenians, Azerbaijanis in Russia and in Georgia, right, or in the past in Soviet Union weren't fighting. Yes, there was maybe some here and there, as any two groups will have, but it wasn't like violent conflict because the problem was some, like in Georgia, this Georgian state is not, it's the Georgian majority in that case, they're minority both in Georgia. In my view, that's the reason for good relationship is not that they are somehow unique, right? So they are not in a space where one dominates the other. So again, the conflict can go away while the region gets colonized, for example. So the bad version of that. So now, meanwhile, before we get to circumstances change, I don't think there is a sustainable solution possible. Again, conceptually, because these identities are built against each other, and again, there's no blueprint for solution in principle. So in that meanwhile, as I mentioned, conflict management, I'd say Cyprus is the best case scenario. Yeah, so full segregation, some kind of a reasonable, few people can cross back and forth, sustain it. In their case, they moved to European Union and everybody has EU passports and can travel around the world. Something to that extent would be, I think, as good as we can count on. And then two more maybe steps here. I think one is normalizing agonism. Normalizing. So I'm a big proponent of agonistic peace, which is normalizing the conflict. So not trying to solve it, but actually accepting that these two identities are built to be confrontational. It's just trying to move it out of physical violence space. And same then I'll apply also to peace building community based on previous point by Könül that right now it's, if you are not with me, you are not supporting my niche position, then you are the enemy. Yeah, that's a problem. So I think we need to have also this agonistic space here. Yeah, so within those who are trying to do peace. If there are realists who are trying to just do ceasefire and they are working with the state, great, because maybe they're actually able to hold the ceasefire more than the most kind of pacifist of us, and vice versa. You need a pacifist to be able to actually propose something which realists will never be able to solve, right? So that relationship doesn't currently exist, and I think that's something to build.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both. We know these are very difficult and complex questions. So thank you very much. Ayla, I think we have one last question.
Yes, so indeed, it will be our final question before we open to the floor, to the audience, and giving a lot of points that was mentioned before, and also how unique the conflict is, how much it was achieved, and maybe the question would be to you to follow up what you said, Phil, like mentioning the agonistic peace and Cyprus. From, let's say, modern history, what would be, let's say, one example, briefly, which can be like top-down effort that succeeded in fostering this reconciliation between societies, and what could be the example of largely bottom-up?
You're not gonna, unfortunately, get me to any good place here today. Very cynically, the top-down solved reconciliation is complete bombing to the ground of Japan and Germany. So very top-down and pretty good reconciliation for good 70 years. But that was combined. So first, that complete domination, followed by Marshall Plan, followed by European Union, right, and NATO and so on. So essentially, it wasn't followed by then more violence although it was extreme violence starting, of course, from Germany itself, but then inflicted on it. So, but that's where we see 70 years of peace and prosperity, right? So somewhere. But again, it was coupled with a very clear blueprint for what peace can look like, which was effectively the liberal democracy and all these institutions. And so and then maybe some school exchanges, yeah, between Germans and French. But I don't think school exchanges is what did it. I think it was the bombing along with Marshall Plan, right? So which was and European Union. So very intentional structures built to sustain, then within which you can do reconciliation. Softer example, I guess. Sorry for the second one. I want to give a more positive one. Is the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland? But there are two caveats here. Yeah, one is that is it peace? Yes, there's no violence to the extent we've seen, but the big question if it got to sustainable peace. But the second one, it was already enacted within that European Union. So yeah, I think that was possible only after all of that first step was done, very Victor's peace version. Then within that, sure, so you can probably have some peace between, yeah, Catalans and Castilians and Northern Irish. But as long as that bigger structure holds up, so remove it, and I'll doubt it will hold too long. So that's the up down. Bottom up.
Bottom up, yeah.
Bottom up, I think is fantastic. I don't within this. I think nation state is by default a violent structure. Essentially, yeah, so it's built as an army. It's built as a militarist space. So it's built on enmity and on what else. I don't see that big picture structural change coming bottom up. I think what it can be is that communities can keep themselves out. So you can have a localized peace. I don't think peace and war are ever absolute. Yeah, you can. I moved from Armenia, which was in war supposedly, to Boston, which was in peace. And in daily life, I would say Yerevan was very peaceful. I never seen any, like even on the street, you don't have violence, right? To people to each other. So unless you drive to Karabakh, there would be no war in my daily life. And then I moved to Boston in a pretty, the cheapest apartment I could afford. There was shooting every evening, every single evening. So it was actually the war you imagine it. Right? So war and peace is never, as absolute. And I think what bottom up does, Colombia is a good example. Pretty problematic structure, but we have big pockets of Colombia that are very bottom up way holding peace and essentially refusing to let violence come in. I think you can make peace in certain communities within a larger structure of war.
Well, thank you. And briefly for you, Könül.
Yeah, I won't, I think, create anything new here, but I think that as a first example of top-down, I think, again, I don't know if we can say this, but the way how Germany faced the consequences of the Second World War and paying repatriation, I think, to Israel, perhaps that could be as a effective top-down approach, and a kind of a mixture of top-down and bottom-up. Maybe South Africa's this commission, I think it was named. So it was like the driving force was from bottom, of course, grassroots organizations and even religious organizations like church and everything. So it was very bottom up. But then those initiatives, they got promoted, approved, and adopted by the state. So I think that was a very nice combination of the top down and bottom up, how they can meet actually, and that makes it more complete. So yeah, nothing to add on that.
Thank you. I mean,
maybe
we can go.
That's the main thing. If both things could be combined, I think that would be the golden middle. So
yeah. Well, yeah, we can go endlessly, of course, and more in depth of all this discussion, but unfortunately we don't have so much time. So thank you both for all these important points to talk about, and something that we could all take it and learn from it. I mean, I will now give it the floor to Arnold to turn it for the questions from the audience. Arnold?
So thank you so much for that very insightful discussion. Thank you to the hosts and our guests. So now we are opening the floor to questions from the audience. So as a reminder, you may just unmute yourself and turn on your video preferably and directly ask our guests any questions you have, or alternatively, please send your questions directly as a chat to me, Arnold Alabert, or I mean Bright Garden Voices in this Zoom. So send it as a DM, a direct message, and I will direct it to our guests. So I see a hand. Oh, is that Diego? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, it's a question from one of our members, but he was unable to join now. And I don't know if either of you would like to answer it, but he was asking, why does the current peace negotiations, why can we think they will be different from Kazan or Key West, when there was also advances and some text agreed, but then there was no signature? What can we expect differently from those moments?
Can take it on. So in principle, I guess the question probably was asked prior and assumed that we will be saying something good about current situation. We didn't. So in that sense, if we expect a solution out of this as opposed to Kazan now. Having said that, I do want to outline a couple of major differences. Both positive and negative. I think in Kazan, still, it was probably last time, actually I even wrote an article then that it's probably the last chance to solve it. Well, it still was international community holding when Russia, at that period, that Obama-Russia hit the reset, where the US and Russia were pretty much on the same page in terms of solution. US outsourced effectively its role to Russia and was backing it up. It was still Russia itself was kind of hesitant still to go full authoritarian or maybe kind of swing back a bit, right? So this is, I think, really last chance. So that's the negative. I think then it was possible. I think it was major miscalculation from Armenia and Azerbaijan not to take that opportunity. And I told that privately. I wrote about that, saying that's it. So 2012 is never, that is no end of the story. There will be no chance for a solution. So that's the negative difference now. The positive one, though, is that forum shopping at the time, we were negotiating more with US and Russia as opposed to with each other necessarily, right? So it's that agency with a much more problematic space, but I think the reclamation of agency is, or claiming of agency is new. So I think in that sense, it's completely now up to the sides to move forward or not, while it's still possible. Again, very soon it will not be possible again, because we will have to be, right now the big powers are distracted for a short period of time from this region, and as soon as one or the other returns with full force, it's back to you negotiating with somebody else, not with each other.
Maybe just quickly on that, definitely agree with the mischance in Kazan. And yes, at the moment, I briefly touched upon during the previous questions, is that before 2020, even if we look how the main mediators were trying to facilitate with the process and everything, again, it gave an impression, and in some cases it was true, that they were in a way comfortable, not perhaps fine, not happy, but comfortable with status quo, because for them, the main thing is to prevent the conflict, prevent the main war. No war, no peace. So a frozen conflict. But now, I think it's different. It's, again, direct negotiations. And in a way, I think sides are okay with that. That can, I think it's a very positive thing to keep it direct, and so this is a fundamental thing that was different from the previous year. Turn into the new Kazan or in a new format. We see the format change, and again taking into account all the developments now that are going on in the world. I think the site understands to turn other way around. So the world is different than it was before. That's why I think it will not repeat the same kind of cycle that it was in the previous negotiations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's see, I still don't have anything directly sent to me. I don't think anyone from the audience wants to just unmute and ask a question. If not, I actually have a question, and I want to ask both of you, but it relates to something Phil brought up a couple times during the discussion today. You mentioned, you touched upon the sort of this binary construction of identity vis-a-vis the conflict, the Armenian and Azerbaijani society, and of course, you augment that to the diaspora, etc. So I was wondering, and a lot of my own research, not in this directly in this Armenia-Azerbaijan context, deals with sort of this group identity formation, the centrality of boundaries, violence, etc. So I was wondering if you could suggest some really good literature, some scholarship on this in the Armenia-Azerbaijan context. So whoever wants to start, Könül or Phil.
Könül, you go.
I need to think of if I know any scholarship on the future.
All right, I'll go then. I think well, you have a couple of types of scholarship, right? So one is a bit more traditional, in a sense of like, and we had a pretty good, interesting scholarships that was partially coming out of the country, especially it was heavily servicing the war, let's say, and there was direct or indirect censorship or self-censorship, right? But still interesting scholarship. If you look into the creation of identity, I will need to look into specific names. But there, of course, have been, again, you can more as a researcher maybe look at it as opposed to necessarily taking it on face value. But that was very strong production of nationalist literature and also movies and so on. So not only literature, by the way, throughout this couple of decades. In terms of critical scholarship and looking into alternatives, I mean, classic work, I think absolutely needs to be known by anybody interested in this identity formation. I'd say Terry Martin's and Ron Sunnis, a couple of books, Affirmative Action Empire and Something of the Nations. I'm spacing out of the second one. But there's so Ronald Sunni and Terry Martin, if you just check in their main book written in early 90s, I think is absolutely foundational, that really traces this current version of Armenian Azerbaijani identities to the Soviet institutions as opposed to some kind of time immemorial. Yes, there were ethnic groups and all, but the way we came to be in this particular format, very ethno-nationalist with very similar somewhat myths of its kind of historical roots and what else, starting there, and the institutionalization of Armenian Azerbaijani identities in opposition to each other effectively in this space. I think that's a very critical one. So earlier post-Soviet years, you have a couple of Russian interesting authors, Tishkov. I need to again and who was the War of Memories? Schnirelman, if I'm not wrong. I need to double check, but it's called War of Histories or War of Memories, specifically focusing on Caucasus. So that was an interesting work. More contemporary, you have Sergei Rumyantsev, with whom I co-authored a number of things, has been very systematically looking into the questions of identity specifically through political discourse and textbooks and kind of political and educational texts. So pretty much everything he writes, and he writes very systematically over the last 20 years, is in that direction. There have been others, Mikhail Zolyan, Ilham Abbasov, well, myself, you can find some works in this direction, a lot of times in co-authorship with them, Sevil Husseinova. So there is again a number of our age contemporaries, effectively our generation authors who have taken up the scholarship. The younger ones, there is Flora Hazarian and
Mir Kamran.
Kamran, yeah. Hussein Lee.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, so they're co-authored and single-authored, separately authored a number of critical articles on this topic. So there is a Caucasus edition, the journal I'm one of the editors of. If you scroll back a bit, yes, especially earlier years, it has when it was more academic than now. Now it turned a bit more analytic. It has, so there has been. It's not very systematic. It's not maybe obvious where to find. But there has been quite a lot of literature, interestingly, by Armenians to Azerbaijanis, especially. Yeah, so it started not like that. Started by of course, Tom Deval, forgot the key name, Thomas Deval's Black Garden, but also articles. But Lawrence Browers's books, the latest book he wrote was right before the war, and he's updating now. So you'll have a second edition that already incorporates the recent history. It's Armenian-Azerbaijani Anatomy of Rival.
Yeah, that's the title. Yeah,
fantastic book. So exactly looking into this. Thomas Deval's not only Black Gardens but also Caucasus, the introduction, maybe more important in this regard because it looks into development of identities more than the other one, better known one. The Black Garden is more about the war itself. So that the Caucasus, the introduction is much more goes into the historical roots of identity formation. So there is quite a bit of literature given the, these are small countries.
Thank you so much for those insightful comments. Let us go to Ayla.
Yes, thank you. I have a question to Philip. I think you've mentioned towards the end about the localized piece, and yeah, that struck me immediately, and I thought, the question that I have, like, do you believe or do you have some sort of examples of this kind of a localized piece, especially in the northern border area between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which was, I think, per se might be influenced by informal trade? And can it be, to some extent, become some sort of invisible, decentralized network of all these cities, which can potentially undermine the whole perception of the conflict, also giving a little bit of agonistic ideology, giving the fact that there is just small settlements in that area?
Könül probably is much more actually optimistic than I am currently. So I would count on you more than myself at this in terms of the possibilities and chances. But yeah, the famous example, of course, was Sadakhlo market. It was right on the border in Georgia that functioned until 2005, despite, so pretty much throughout the war, despite everything. I served actually in the army, was conscript in late 90s in the northern border. And this is very isolated from the Yerevan part. You can see that, the towns in Azerbaijan are right there, like we can see them, while Yerevan is mountains and non-functional roads away. And they have produced, but they cannot really take it to Yerevan because there is much closer producers. So it was extremely impoverished area and was very clear that they any moment are ready to, essentially, right? So yes, maybe they'll talk nationalist stuff over a dinner table But then go on saying, oh my God, when is this road going to open? Because, yeah, so this is my neighbors and, my friends from the other side. It stayed. It didn't go away. And it's not only in the northern, also in Gyumri, you have similar. You can have very nationalist conversation on one hand about Turkey, but simultaneously, when is Turkey border going to open? Because again, it's pretty impoverished and far removed. So yes, we clearly once, if and while rather it was possible. But this is where I'm saying I don't think it can go too far because, right, so that's possible if at least the borders are open, but the borders are not. And so like you cannot necessarily do anything. There's a lot of the grassroots simply is non-functional and there is no physical possibility of physical contact. Yeah, I believe if you create a physical contact, you can see between Turkey and Armenia, even no border, but travel is possible. And you have a pretty, I think Turkey was Armenia's 5th trade partner, despite, right, the closed border, no diplomatic relations, nothing. And people throughout the war, by the way, yeah, through the whole time, continued shuttling and trading and what else. And yes, this of course creates relationships. It's possible, but you need at least, if not help, at least not major obstacles from the governments the way we have them now.
Oh, then, yeah, definitely need to be open borders at least. And what about you, Könül, if you can also have
I
something?
think, yeah, I'm I'm a bit more optimistic. I think, but it is a possibility. And if we think about like a trade, so even for those parts of Azerbaijan, natural market would be more Yerevan than Baku, for example, right? If we talk about the proximity and everything. And bigger cities of Azerbaijan, such as Gamaghelyan and everything, they can be a natural market for those bordering regions with them. Like in some talks with the interlocutors from Armenia and from Azerbaijan, with what now we call former line of contact and everything. There are mainly farmers. And when they face certain difficulties and everything, like a couple of months ago, I know that from interlocutors from Armenia, they were like, we can deal, we can talk to them. We used to do this during the Soviet times, like if we can go and harvest and they can use like our forest or like a land for their farming issues, like really like ordinary problems that back in the days people could solve easily because they were in a way no borders. So people still have that memory of it. And if the agreement is signed, if people feel safe and secure and there's a willing, of course there is a big possibility. And again, both sides will win, especially bordering regions with them, because they're quite isolated on both sides. And it is quite poor regions, right? And this can really boost the local trade, farmers, and people who work in the farming.
Thank you.
Okay, I was trying to see if there's any questions, and there appears to me to be no more. Any other questions or comments? Should we move on to the closing? We should. So before we end the episode, is there anything, Könül or Phil, you want to add? Any word of wisdom?
I just want to say, first of all, really thank you for your invite. Thank you for your initiative. And I mean it when I say that it is very important to keep initiatives like this where people can meet up, where people have a space to talk, space to hear. And this is really very important. The conflict and the way how it is now, the way how it was, it's really transformed. I think one of the key things that perhaps when analyzing, when writing books or articles and everything is is to keep in mind that it is very complex conflict, and that has been going on for 30 plus years. There were a lot of lost grievances, traumas, and it's very important to look at it not episodically, like 20 plus or after 2020, but see it as a bigger picture and in all its complexity that it is. So only through acknowledging both sides' grievances, both sides' loss and fears that comes with that, I think we can see a clear picture and we could, in a way, move on. And this can contribute immensely to the peace negotiations and to preparing the population for peace. So thank you very much for inviting, and it was a pleasure to share this space with Phil and with all of you.
I 100% agree. Thank you so much, Könül. Phil, any words?
Yeah, first we want to actually take Könül for joining. I know so probably one of the first public appearances recently. So thank you for that. I'll start with the content and then circle back to the thank yous. But I think want to follow up on what Könül said, that search for identity. I think what's that Armenian-Azerbaijani political or future of political identity of the people living there. Maybe it's not going to be called Armenian-Azerbaijani necessarily only. I think that's an extremely important quest, and without that, while it's Armenian-Azerbaijani, I think the conflict is a given almost because of how much these identities are rooted in the trauma inflicted on each other, right? So what is this next stage of identity? And I think you are pushing that conversation in some form, directly and indirectly. I want to thank for that. I was struck by you said we are a grassroots initiative, I think Arnold said earlier. And first question was, what kind of grassroots? None of us is even in Armenia or Azerbaijan. That was my first reaction. And neither of you, as we heard, neither Könül or I, right? And in my mind, the grassroots is this, should be necessarily a person who lives in some, not even Yerevan or Baku, right? In some kind of a smaller place in Armenia, Azerbaijan. And then I thought, am I right? And then I was challenged by these last 2 hours thinking about that no, you meant effectively, this is not some kind of organized by anybody, right? So you came together, and really what the meaning of grassroots is changing, right? So are we less impacted or less have a voice? So that on its own, right? So that you are now a grassroots initiative. Well, some of us are not even Armenian, Azerbaijani by any means, and others, partially are and partially are citizens of other countries. So that changes completely the meaning. Suddenly we are not binary anymore, right? So we are Argentinians and Armenians at the same time, right? So what does it mean for the future? So I think maybe you are doing it through this by redefining grassroots, by redefining really what it means to be Armenian-Azerbaijani. So I want to thank you for that as well, and not just for the invitation.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. And of course, Phil, you've been of help throughout these past several years. Sometimes I ask you for guidance on things about the initiative, and thank you for being there. And we have some of our members in the Caucasus. We started with 3 people, me, Diego, and Aidan, who were outside of the Caucasus. That's how we started on Twitter and the community around us. And the conflict does reinforce this Armenian and Azerbaijani, this sort of nationalizing, ethnicizing sort of forces upon societies that are not necessarily ethnically, homogeneously Armenian, Azerbaijani, however you want to define that. So the conflict itself constructs sort of these perceptions of the state, the society, even the diaspora to some degree. So in any case, thank you so much to my co-hosts, Anush, Ayla. Thank you so much again, Phil and Könül. This was a very insightful conversation with 2 individuals who have actually been in this conflict resolution or conflict-related sort of on the scholarly, on the civil society scene, on the track 2 specialist scene, and more. So thank you to our audience. Thank you to everyone who joined. This meeting has been recorded and will be put online to be viewed on YouTube and on other social media spaces. And please do follow us for our future activities and content. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and cheers.